What if I told you that the modern world as you know it, the 40-hour workweek, Social Security, the very idea that the government should prevent you from starving, wasn't built on a foundation of progress and ideals? What if I told you it was all built on a foundation of absolute, paralyzing, system-wide fear? We look back at the 1920s as a party, the Roaring Twenties. Jazz, flappers, and a stock market that, everyone believed, could only go up. It was the birth of the American dream. But it was an illusion, a fever dream. And in 1929, the world didn't just stumble, it fell off a cliff. This wasn't a recession. This was a complete and total systemic failure. It was a moment in time when the very logic of capitalism inverted itself. And I'm not just talking about rich bankers jumping out of windows. I'm talking about a world that became profoundly, terrifyingly illogical. A world where farmers, desperate to feed their own children, were forced to burn mountains of their own corn for fuel. A world where millions of gallons of fresh milk were dumped into rivers, while nearby in the cities, children were dying from malnutrition. This is the story of the Great Depression. But it's not the black and white photo story you learned in school. This is the story of how the American dream became a collective nightmare. It's the story of how that nightmare almost handed the world to fascism, how the same poison that birthed Hitler began to flow through the veins of America itself. And most importantly, it's the story of how we, today, are standing dangerously close to forgetting every single lesson we paid for in blood and starvation. It all began not with a bang, but with a creeping silence. The silence of a factory floor after the final whistle. The silence of a bank door being locked for the last time. In the cities, the unemployment rate didn't just rise, it exploded. It rocketed towards 25%. 1 in every 4 able-bodied people had no work. And that number doesn't even count the millions more who had their hours and wages slashed to almost nothing, or the women who were simply forced out of the workforce entirely. Proud families, who just a year before had owned their own homes and cars, were now seen in bread lines, shuffling forward for a bowl of watery soup. When the banks foreclosed on their homes, they had nowhere to go. So they built shanty towns. They built them in city parks, on railroad sidings, in empty lots. They built them out of scrap tin, cardboard, old tires, and piano crates. These towns became a bitter, nationwide joke. They called them Hoovervilles, a sarcastic tribute to the president, Herbert Hoover, who kept insisting that prosperity was just around the corner. Inside these Hoovervilles, there was no running water, no sanitation. Disease, like diphtheria and tuberculosis, ran rampant. People cooked scraps of food when they could find them, over open fires. Men who were once skilled engineers, carpenters, and accountants now spent their days fighting over scraps from restaurant garbage cans. This was the profound psychological break. The system hadn't just failed them, it had humiliated them. It had stripped them of their dignity. But as bad as it was in the cities, the situation in the countryside was a special kind of hell. It was the ultimate stupid irony. The farmers of the American heartland were producing too much. They had bumper crops of wheat, corn, and cotton, but in the cities, no one had any money to buy it. The price of crops collapsed so completely that it cost a farmer more to harvest and transport his food than he could possibly sell it for. So, they burned it. They used perfectly good wheat and corn to heat their homes, because it was cheaper than coal. They slaughtered pigs and buried them in lime pits. They dumped thousands of gallons of milk onto the roads, where it pooled and soured, all while the nation starved. This is the image of the Depression, starvation in the midst of plenty. The machine of capitalism had broken so thoroughly that it was now actively destroying the very things needed for survival. And then, the earth itself turned on them. A catastrophic drought settled over the Great Plains. The land, which had been overfarmed and stripped of its natural grasses, simply dried up. The topsoil turned to fine powder, and the wind came. They called them black blizzards. Giant rolling clouds of dust a mile high that blotted out the sun for days. It buried farms, suffocated cattle, and filled the lungs of children, causing a new plague. Dust pneumonia. This was the Dust Bowl. And it triggered one of the largest migrations in American history. Hundreds of thousands of families, dubbed Okies, whether they were from Oklahoma or not, packed everything they owned into rickety jalopies and headed west, chasing a rumor of work in California. They became a legion of homeless migrant workers, despised by the locals and exploited by the large corporate farms, living in squalid camps. The American dream had become a refugee crisis. In this environment of total collapse, people looked to their leader, President Herbert Hoover. Hoover was not an evil man, he was just the wrong man. He was an engineer. He believed in rugged individualism. He believed the system would correct itself. He was convinced that government handouts would destroy the moral fiber of the American people. But as people were literally starving to death, this moral fiber argument began to sound like a cruel joke. The people weren't asking for a handout, they were just asking for a chance. And the ultimate proof of this came in 1932, in the single most shameful moment of the entire crisis. It was the arrival of the bonus army. Who were they? They were heroes. They were the veterans of World War I. The very men who, just 14 years earlier, had been sent to Europe to make the world safe for democracy. The government had promised them a bonus for their service, a payment scheduled for 1945, but their families were starving now. So between 12,000 and 15,000 of these veterans, many with their wives and children, did the most American thing imaginable. They marched to Washington, D.C. to peacefully petition their government. They set up a massive, orderly Hooverville near the Capitol. They held polite protests. They were patriots, and they truly believed their government would listen. They were wrong. Hoover's administration panicked. They saw these veterans not as desperate patriots, but as a revolutionary mob, as communists. Hoover gave the order to disperse them, and the man he entrusted with the job was General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, believing he was saving the Republic from a communist takeover, assembled his troops. Not police, the active U.S. Army. 4 troops of cavalry, a column of infantry with fixed bayonets and gas masks, and 6 battle tanks. They rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue. They attacked their own veterans. They fired tear gas into the camp, the gas choking men, women, and children. The infantry advanced with bayonets, pushing the veterans back. The cavalry charged. They set the camp on fire, burning the veterans' meager belongings to the ground. During the chaos, 2 veterans were shot and killed, and in an incident of profound horror, a 2-month-old baby, the son of a veteran, died from tear gas inhalation. Another young boy, trying to run back to his family's burning shack to save his pet rabbit, was stopped by a soldier who stabbed him in the leg with a bayonet. The nation was horrified. This was the bottom. This wasn't just a system failing. This was a government actively, violently declaring war on its most desperate and heroic citizens. Herbert Hoover's reputation was destroyed forever. And the country, now leaderless and broken, was teetering on the edge of a revolution. When hope dies, and the system offers nothing but cruelty, a vacuum is created. And into that vacuum, monsters are born. People become desperate for any answer, any leader, any simple explanation for their complex pain. And across the ocean, in Germany, they found one. Germany had been ravaged by the Depression just as badly as the U.S. Their economy, built on a mountain of American loans, collapsed overnight when those loans were called in. Their democracy, the fragile Weimar Republic, was paralyzed. And in this chaos, a failed painter with a talent for demagoguery began to find an audience. In 1929, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party was a joke, polling at less than 2% of the vote. By 1933, fueled by the desperation of the Depression, he was the Chancellor of Germany. He didn't take power in a violent coup. He was given it. He was elected. Why? Because he gave the German people a simple, powerful story. He told them their suffering wasn't their fault. It wasn't the system's fault. It was the fault of a scapegoat. The Jews. The international globalist bankers. He gave them an enemy to hate, and it felt better than hating themselves. And do not for one second think America was immune to this poison. The exact same forces were at work. The vacuum was here too. A Catholic priest named Father Coughlin became one of the most powerful men in America. From his radio pulpit, he preached to an audience of 30 million people, blaming the Depression not on failed policy, but on a conspiracy of Jewish bankers. His rhetoric was pure, unfiltered anti-Semitism, and he was wildly popular. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been in decline, saw a massive resurgence. They added Jews, Catholics, and immigrants to their hate list, claiming to be the defenders of true white Protestant Americans. And then there was the German-American Bund. This wasn't a fringe group. In 1939, they held a pro-American rally, not in some hidden basement, in Madison Square Garden in the heart of New York City. 20,000 people showed up. They unfurled a massive banner of George Washington flanked by swastikas. They cheered, they sieg-heiled, and they denounced President Roosevelt, calling his New Deal a Jew deal. This is the path the Depression opened. Fascism was not some foreign disease. It was a symptom of economic collapse. And it was growing right here at home. Democracy itself was on the deathbed. Into this chaos stepped one of the most complex figures in history, an aristocrat from New York, confined to a wheelchair by polio, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When FDR took office, the country was just days, perhaps hours, away from total collapse. The banking system had completely frozen. People were hoarding cash under their mattresses. Roosevelt's first act in his inauguration speech was not to propose a policy. It was to perform psychological surgery on the nation. He looked them in the eye and said the words that would define an era. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He wasn't just being poetic. He was giving a diagnosis. The fear had become the problem. The paralysis was psychological. So his first move was pure genius. He declared a national bank holiday. He closed every single bank in America. It sounds crazy, but what it did was stop the panic. It was a hard reset. Then, over the next few days, his team audited the banks. A few days later, Roosevelt went on the radio for his first fireside chat. He spoke to the American people not like a president, but like a father. He explained in simple, calm terms what had happened. He said the sound banks were going to reopen, and that it was now safer to put your money in a bank than under your mattress. And the people, desperate for a leader they could trust, believed him. When the banks reopened, people didn't rush to pull their money out. They lined up to put it back in. He hadn't fixed the economy. He had fixed the trust. Then he unleashed a flurry of experiments. The New Deal. It was a chaotic alphabet soup of new agencies. The CCC, the WPA, the TVA. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, took millions of unemployed young men, gave them uniforms and food, and sent them into the wilderness to plant trees, build national parks, and fight forest fires. Did the country desperately need those trees planted? Maybe not. But those young men desperately needed a paycheck. They desperately needed dignity. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, built roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals. But it also hired artists to paint murals, musicians to give free concerts, and writers to record the stories of former slaves. Roosevelt's philosophy was simple. Try something. If it works, keep doing it. If it doesn't, admit it and try something else. But for God's sake, do something. He was accused of being a socialist, a communist, a dictator. The business world, which had adored Hoover, despised him. The Supreme Court tried to strike down his programs, but he saved capitalism from itself, and he knew who the enemy was. He decided to clean up Wall Street. To head the brand new Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the new police force for the stock market, he made a shocking choice. He picked Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the future president. Kennedy was a notorious market manipulator, a man who had made a fortune in the 1920s through speculation, insider trading, and allegedly bootlegging. The press was outraged. They said Roosevelt was setting a thief to catch a thief. And Roosevelt reportedly replied, "That's right, because it takes one to catch one." He wasn't an ideologue. He was a pragmatic operator. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was trying to prevent one. But here is the great inconvenient truth of the Great Depression. The New Deal did not end it. All those programs, all that spending, it helped. It stabilized the patient. It saved American democracy from the lure of fascism. It gave people hope. But in 1939, after nearly a decade of the New Deal, the unemployment rate in America was still over 17%. The economy was still on life support. So what finally cured it? What was the engine that pulled not just America, but the entire world, out of the deepest economic black hole in modern history? The answer is horrifying. It was World War II. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. As the world plunged into war, Roosevelt declared that America must become the great arsenal of democracy. The factories that had sat silent for a decade didn't restart to build dams or parks. They roared to life to build B-17 bombers, to build Sherman tanks, to build aircraft carriers and Liberty ships. The WPA was replaced by the war effort. The government spending of the New Deal was dwarfed by the apocalyptic spending of global war. That is what brought back full employment. By 1940, as the war machine geared up, unemployment vanished. The greatest, most prosperous economy in the history of the world, the American post-war boom, was built on the industrial mobilization required to fight the most destructive war in human history. That is the terrifying lesson. We were saved from economic collapse by a global catastrophe, and in 1945, the great fear was that as soon as the war ended and the soldiers came home, the depression would come right back. So, what did we really learn from it all? We learned that a system without rules will eat itself. So we created regulations, like Glass-Steagall, to separate regular banks from the casinos of Wall Street. We learned that a society that lets its old, its sick, and its unemployed starve is not just cruel, but unstable. So we created a social safety net, Social Security, unemployment insurance, the minimum wage. For a generation, it worked. We built the largest and most equitable middle class in history. And then, we forgot. Starting in the 1980s, we began to dismantle the very regulations we had built. We were told that greed is good. We tore down the walls between the banks and the casinos, and in 2008 we got a terrifying echo. The system imploded again, for many of the same reasons. And today, the wealth gap between the richest 1% and everyone else is wider than it was in 1929. Millions of people feel left behind, unheard, and desperate, just as they did in the 1930s. And what do we see rising in that vacuum of hope? The same old poisons. The same search for simple answers and convenient scapegoats. The same rise of demagogues and extremism, here and around the world. The Great Depression isn't history, it's a warning. It's a mirror. It teaches us that an economic system that serves only the very few at the top is not just unfair, it is fundamentally unstable. It will eventually break. And the cost of that breaking is measured in starvation, in violence, and in the rise of monsters. So here is the question I leave you with. What single lesson from the 1930s do you think is the most urgent for us to remember right now? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that understanding the past is the only way to navigate the present, if you want to keep diving deep into the ideas that shape our world, then make sure you are subscribed. It is the best way to ensure we don't miss our next conversation.